Anyway, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. No, there are advantages and disadvantages of being the last speaker. But I've been too long accustomed to being the last speaker, so I thought I would speak at the end after my other colleagues have spoken. Going through looking at the proceedings that have gone by, it looks as though I'm the odd man out. Because all the speakers before me, Anjaneya went through you may not call it a coaching institute, a guidance program. And he elaborately explained his experiences with Dr. Rao. In fact, I would consider it a very genuine and heartfelt and at the same time very insightful tribute to a man who really made history in his sphere of activity, that is Dr. Rao. And Krishna Rao, though he didn't go through any coaching institute, he is now a formidable teacher himself, a Vadyar by any standard. So many so many institutions he teaches. For he is a versatile teacher himself. And the other speakers are also closely associated with teaching. And I am the only person who hasn't done any kind of teaching at all. In fact, I didn't also go through any institute when I wrote the civil services examination. I also wrote only once and passed in the very first attempt. I didn't have to write a second time. Though a lot of my friends and other well-wishers insisted that I should appear again because I entered the Indian Police Service on my first attempt. And they said, no, you must have a crack at the IAS. For write again. So I didn't do that. Looking back, I don't think I missed anything by not writing again and qualifying for the IAS. Now, I belong to more or less the first generation of civil servants, in a manner of speaking, because I belong to the 9th regulars, that is the 9th examination after independence, which I took and passed. And in those days, I studied in Presidency College, Madras, now Chennai. And I did physics. For in those days, there were only 2 institutions which either coached or gave guidance for the civil services examination. One was Rao's Study Circle, and the other, as Anjaneya Reddy recalled, was the IAS Institute in Madras. But all those who thought that they had a chance to pass the civil service examination considered it beneath themselves to go to a coaching institute. For the coaching institutes were looked down upon in those days. As I said, I also didn't get any coaching of any kind. Later, I happened to read on these coaching institutions. So I think the speakers before me have touched upon other aspects of guidance and coaching to these civil services examination. I would like to let you into a little history, past history about these coaching institutions. Most of you must be aware that before 1857 was the Sipahis mutiny, which we now call the First War of Independence. Before 1857, there was no competitive examination for the Indian civil service. In the beginning, when the East India Company ruled, they picked up some of those fellows whom they knew in their own families, in their friends' families. People who were not very good at studies and who were kind of nuisance to their parents. They picked up these guys and packed them off to India as what they call writers. Writers. Calcutta, the secretariat is called the Writers' Building even today. For these writers, all that they knew was a little account keeping, nothing more than that. Robert Clive himself was a writer who really laid the foundation for the British Empire in India. And Warren Hastings thereafter, and so many others. So these writers were all, it was a kind of a patriot, a sort of a family club. So you picked up some of your nephews and cousins and all who were not finding it very comfortable live in England, packed them off to become writers. They all later became civilians, collectors and district officers and what have you. Lord Wellesley, who was who became the Governor General at the turn of 19th century, I think he became the Governor General in 1899 and stayed on till 1904 or 1905. He found all these civilians not very useful and not trained at all. And therefore he thought that he should start a training college in Fort William to teach them Indian languages, a bit of Indian history, and a little of Sanskrit, a little of Arabic and Persian, so that he could prepare them to be more useful civilians in the districts. But Wellesley had a nasty habit of doing everything first and then reporting to his court of directors of the East India Company. For he used to irritate the directors in the court. For what they did was, when he reported to London that he had set up this Oriental College to train civilians in Fort William, they promptly asked him to stop it, because it entailed a lot of expenditure and the East India Company was not making profits at that point of time. But soon they realized the usefulness of training their civilians. For they started an institution in England itself, first in Hertford Castle, and within a few years after that they built an exclusive training institution at a place called Hailbury. From about 1908 or 1909 till about 1808 or 1809 till about 1858, Hailbury trained the Indian civilians. And there again, they had a limited competitive examination, limited to the candidates that the court of directors and the various lords and nobles sponsored. Again, it was a family club. So they sponsored about 100, 150 fellows, and they were put through a competitive test, and about 40 or 50 of them came out of the competitive test, and then they were trained in Hailbury. So after 1857, when the governance of India passed from the hands of the East India Company to the British Crown, they introduced the competitive examination, which was the foundation of the Indian civil service as we know it today. And this competition, I think the qualifications went through many changes over the period of time. But basically, the competition, this competitive examination, bypassed Oxford, Cambridge, the University of London, the University of Glasgow, the St. Andrews, all these established British institutions, because the syllabus for the competitive examination and the manner of testing the candidates, all this did not have any kind of relationship with what they taught in Oxford and Cambridge in the initial years. And therefore, they needed training institutions. And that is how training institutions for the civil service competitive examination in England started. And a number of institutions sprouted in London and in the neighborhood, just as we have, scores of institutions in India today. And the most famous of them was an institution called Wren and Gurney in London. And over time, these coaching institutions came to be called as crammers. That is where the candidates are put through a cramming examination, and then they pass the examination and enter the civil service. They were called the crammers. And there were many crammers in London and around, of which the most famous was this Wren and Gurney. Now the crammers produced their own kind of civilians, whom the Hailbury chaps who preceded them didn't like very much. And in fact, the Hailbury guys used to call the crammers as arrogant, conceited, and underbred. See, the Hailbury fellows all came from, the families of nobles and lords. For they found these guys who came through the crammers, they were very arrogant because they came through a civil service examination, but they were considered underbred. And even Matthew Arnold, Matthew Arnold, the poet, the English poet, he taught at Hailbury. And he also felt that these civilians who came through the civil service competitive examination, he, in his characteristic poetic language, he said they are crammed men, not formed men. The crammed men, not formed men. Therefore, but over a period of time, the British government and the Indian government, in India also found that these civilians who came through the examination, though they might not be formed men, they may be crammed men, there were less of bad fellows, bad eggs. Hailbury produced a lot of bad eggs, and there were also less of geniuses, because the Hailbury guys liked the countryside, liked the outdoors, and the crammers liked the capitals, where you could lead a comfortable life. So anyway, this is history. This is the history behind the coaching institutions that were formed in India when the ICS and the Indian police, Imperial Police, gave way to the Indian Administrative Service, the Indian Police Service, and other related civil services and all that. So initially, we also looked down upon these teaching institutions, as I have said. To my knowledge, none of my generation, those who qualified for the IAS or the IPS or the central services, ever went through the IAS Institute or the Rao Study Circle in the initial years. Later, of course, Rao Study Circle produced them in copious numbers. Now, this is the background. And I didn't know Dr. Rao till I met him one day at a dinner. This was, I think, probably in the late 80s or early 80s in Hyderabad at some French place. I met him and I was introduced to him and so and so. Then he went into his background. He didn't tell me that it was the antecedent verification which kept him out of the civil service. He said he qualified for the civil service examination, but was not selected finally. I thought probably he got a low rank and did not make the grade. That was the impression I got. But he was a very interesting person. And the relevance of these study circles or coaching institutions, whichever way you may call them, has come to the fore in India also in a peculiar way. Now, you know, in the civil service, ICS examination, in fact, the ICS was considered to be more coveted than the home civil service. In fact, the more brilliant, the more adventurous preferred the ICS to the home civil service. Dalhousie, who was the last Governor General under the East India Company, you know, Canning, who came next, he was not merely the Governor General, he also became the Viceroy, the first Viceroy. Dalhousie was an imperialist. In fact, the Sepoys' mutiny was largely due to Dalhousie's follies. Now, Dalhousie, you know what he said? He said a home civil service officer is at best a clerk in the secretariat. But an Indian civil service officer is a proconsul. As a district officer, he had enormous influence, enormous power, and enormous capacity to change the course of lives of the people for whom he worked. For Dalhousie described the district officers in the Indian civil service as proconsuls. For with the result, over a period of time in the Indian civil service, in fact, I think around 1930 or 32, when they took a census, there were 1,174 Indian civil service officers at that time, of whom 600 came from Oxford and 300 came from Cambridge. And the remaining fellows came from, Glasgow and Edinburgh and St. Andrews and Delhi, London School of Economics or the University of London. So the same thing happened in India also. In the initial years, the first 2 decades, for instance, I'll tell you, in my own year, my examination, I think there were 66 or 64 chaps who went into the foreign service and the administrative service. And out of the 64 who went into these 2 services, I think almost 20 belonged to the Madras University. 1/3 of them. 8 of them in the IAS belonged to the Presidency College. 7 of them belonged to the Loyola College. And 2 or 3 to Christian College and another 2 or 3 to St. Joseph's, Trichy. In fact, Natarajan, my batchmate who was the chief secretary here, he came from St. Joseph's, Trichy. Dorasamy, who's also my batchmate, he came from Presidency. And like that, Krishnan, I think, Krishnan and Balakrishnan, my batchmates, they came from Loyola. For here within Andhra Pradesh Kada. For out of 64, 65, more than 20 fellows came from Madras University, and probably about 14, 15 came from Delhi, and out of them about 7 or 8 from St. Stephen's College, Delhi, and another dozen or 15 from Allahabad. For 1 dozen, 15, 30, 20, the other 15 or 16 came from all the other universities in India. The reason being, these are the metropolitan cities. For the urban bred fellows, they were able to qualify in the civil service examination. And in my own case, I was a provincial chap from Vijayawada. But I should have normally become an engineer. But when I wrote my intermediate examination, I fell ill. And I wrote my examination in that very severe health condition. With the result, I did not make it to engineering in Guindy. And I said I never liked engineering, therefore I said it was a blessing in disguise. I said, let me have a crack at the competitive examination. That's why I went to Presidency College. I did not go to Voltaire. Deliberately I went to Presidency College to measure myself against the big guys who came from Mylapore and Triplicane and studied in these, hallowed institutions of presidency and all that. And I did quite well. And with the result, they used to look down upon me, and they used to call me a hick. A hick is, one of those unbred, ill-bred fellow from one of the country towns like Vijayawada. Even in the Indian administrative service, foreign service, and police service, the bulk of the candidates in the first 2 decades came from Madras, Delhi, and Allahabad. Only the rest came from other places. So this is where the importance of coaching institutions arose. And even the pattern of the exams, the format of the examination itself was changed. People realized that they're not getting men from the small towns and the 2-tier cities and the 3-tier towns and all into the civil service. So they went into this and then changed the format of the examination, increased the number of chances that you could have a crack at the examination, etc., etc. And later now, they've liberalized it even more. And as a result of these coaching institutions like Rao Study Circle, now we find the Indian Administrative Service, the Police Service, all the other services having, I think, a larger number of people from the small towns and the rural background than those from the urban, the cities and the metropolises. And that is where the importance of the civil service arose. I mean, the coaching institutions and the guidance centers arose. And Anjaneya has a lot of experience with the Hyderabad Study Circle. As he told you, he's got almost 1,000 fellows in sort of parked in various services and establishments. And Rao was indeed a pioneer. I would end my remarks with another observation. John Major, as you know, was the British Prime Minister who succeeded Margaret Thatcher. In one of his conversations, he said, he introspected. And he said, I was not a very brilliant student. For I had no way of cracking the Home Civil Service examination. But at the same time, I didn't want also to be a clerk, lower down in the hierarchy. For I pondered over it and thought the best way of contributing something to the nation was to become a politician. So he became a politician. And he said, by becoming a politician and becoming a minister, you could use the abilities and the genius of the Home Civil Service officers for the nation's good. For the nation's good. So he entered politics and made his way up to become the Prime Minister of England. So that's what Patel did in India. When Patel became the Deputy Prime Minister and the Union Home Minister, Patel was the man who recognized and acknowledged also the capabilities and the talent that was in the Indian civil service. And he fought against his own colleagues. In fact, Nehru was not an admirer of the Indian civil service. Those of you who have read his autobiography would realize he had an utter contempt for the ICS. I suppose partly because he could have never cracked the ICS himself. He was a kind of John Major. Anyway, it is Patel who recognized the value of the Indian civil service and used them to the hilt, to the fullest, to achieve to accomplish some of the great tasks that he had achieved as Deputy Prime Minister and Union Home Minister. But unfortunately, today I can't speak well of our civil services, that includes the Indian Police Service. It's not merely the civil service, but I think that is a subject for another talk, another day. But I thought why I wanted to speak last was give my colleagues the chance to speak what they want and omit whatever they had said and touch upon the other aspects of these coaching institutions. And I think many coaching institutions are doing exceedingly well. I'm not so sure about Rao Study Circle itself, but the greatness about Rao lies in this, that if John Major wanted to utilize the services of the Home Civil Service for the nation's good, Rao, having been denied a position in the civil service himself for reasons extraneous to his merit, he thought that he would train people for the civil service examination and produce them by the dozens and the scores, which I think he must have done. And he did yeoman service to this country by setting up the Rao Study Circle. With these words, I thank the organizers of this function for having given me this opportunity to share my thoughts with you. Thank you.